The door rattled violently, a sound so sudden and out of place that Ethan froze mid-step, his heart pounding. Nobody came this far into the wilderness, especially not during a storm like this. The wind screamed outside as if warning him not to open the door. But then it came again, a frantic, scratching sound, more urgent this time. Swallowing his unease, Ethan grabbed his coat and swung the door open, the cold air slamming into him like a wall of ice. What he saw left him stunned. A German shepherd stood on the porch, her fur matted with ice and snow, her golden eyes filled with desperation. In her mouth she held something, small, fragile, barely moving. A puppy. She staggered forward, collapsing onto the wooden planks, and gently placed the pup at his feet before letting out a low, pitiful whine. Ethan's breath caught as he knelt, his gloved hands trembling as he reached for the tiny creature. It was limp, its fur damp and its body frighteningly cold. He pressed 2 fingers to its chest and felt the faintest rise and fall. A breath, fragile but there. God, Ethan muttered, scooping the pup into his hands. He looked at the shepherd, who hadn't taken her eyes off him. Her body trembled violently, and her ribs showed through her thin coat. She had brought her pup here to save it. To trust him. The weight of that realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "Okay," he said aloud, his voice steadying as adrenaline took over. "Let's get you both inside." The mother hesitated as Ethan stepped back, her eyes darting to the pup in his arms. But when he knelt again, motioning for her to follow, she rose shakily to her feet and limped through the door. Ethan closed it quickly, shutting out the howling storm, and moved to the fireplace. The cabin's warmth was faint but a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. He set the pup down near the fire and grabbed a towel, wrapping the tiny body carefully. The shepherd hovered nearby, her ears twitching and her gaze locked on Ethan. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Ethan murmured as he worked, his fingers gently rubbing the towel to warm the pup. The dog let out a soft whine, her body tense but no longer aggressive. Ethan glanced at her again, noting the frost clinging to her fur and the raw, bloody pads of her paws. How far had she come? How long had she carried her pup through that storm? The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like a lifetime. The pup stirred faintly under the towel, its tiny chest rising and falling more steadily now. Ethan exhaled in relief. "You're a fighter, little one," he said softly. He turned to the mother, who had collapsed onto a blanket he had laid out. "And you're a damn hero." Her golden eyes met his, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to him. The pup whimpered faintly, its fragile body trembling despite the warmth of the towel. Ethan crouched by the fire, carefully rubbing the tiny creature's fur, willing it to fight. The mother lay nearby, her eyes fixed on his every movement. She didn't growl or move closer, but her ears twitched, and her muscles remained tense. Trust hung in the air like a delicate thread, ready to snap at any moment. Ethan grabbed a small heating pad from the closet, one he had used for injured wildlife in the past. He tucked it beneath the towel, hoping it would help the pup regain its strength. "Come on, little guy," he muttered. "You've made it this far." The mother stirred, her body rising from the blanket with slow, deliberate movements. She approached Ethan cautiously, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air around him. Ethan froze, his hands stilling as she drew closer. Her golden eyes bore into his, filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Then, to his surprise, she pressed her nose against his hand. It wasn't a gesture of submission, it was an acknowledgement, a fragile acceptance of his role in their survival. "You're incredible, you know that?" Ethan said softly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. He reached out slowly, resting his hand on her head. She didn't flinch, and for the first time since she arrived, her body seemed to relax. She turned back to the pup, nuzzling it gently as Ethan continued his work. Hours passed in tense silence. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the fire provided a fragile sanctuary. The pup's breathing grew steadier, and its tiny paws twitched under the towel. Encouraged, Ethan prepared a small syringe filled with warm milk and honey, carefully holding it to the pup's mouth. A few drops spilled onto its tongue, and after a moment, the pup's mouth moved weakly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Ethan hope. As he worked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The storm outside seemed louder now, more deliberate. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. His stomach dropped. A faint red light swept through the trees, slicing through the blizzard like a predator searching for prey. "Drones," Ethan muttered, his chest tightening. He turned to the mother, who was already on high alert. Her ears flattened, and her body coiled like a spring. She growled low, her eyes fixed on the window. Ethan grabbed his coat and motioned for her to follow. "We have to move," he said, his voice firm. He scooped up the pup, wrapping it tightly in the towel, and opened the back door. The cold hit him like a slap, but he didn't hesitate. The mother darted ahead, her instincts sharp as she led the way into the trees. The forest was a maze of shadows and snow, the red lights growing brighter behind them. Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts as he followed the mother, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen ground. The drone's hum grew louder, piercing the night like a warning. The mother suddenly stopped, her body low to the ground. Ethan crouched beside her, holding the pup close to his chest. The red light swept past them, illuminating the frost-covered branches overhead. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. Beside him, the mother was still, her golden eyes locked on the source of the sound. When the light moved on, Ethan exhaled shakily. "You knew," he whispered, glancing at the shepherd. "You knew they were coming." She didn't respond, but her gaze softened slightly, as if acknowledging his words. Without wasting another second, they moved again, disappearing deeper into the forest. By the time they reached the creek, the hum of the drones had faded into the distance. Ethan collapsed onto a rock, cradling the pup as the mother paced nearby. The storm had quieted, but the danger wasn't over. Whatever, or whoever, was hunting them wouldn't stop. But as Ethan looked at the mother, standing tall and defiant despite her exhaustion, he felt a spark of hope. Together, they had survived the storm. Together, they would face whatever came next. The firelight flickered across the cabin walls as Ethan crouched near the stranger, his mind racing. Sam lay bundled in blankets, his breathing uneven but steady. The German shepherd mother stood by her pup in the corner, her sharp eyes darting between Ethan and this new arrival. Trust was a fragile thread in the room, stretched taut by the weight of the unknown. Ethan stared at the man, his body tense. "You said you were looking for someone?" he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "Who?" Sam coughed weakly, his eyes fluttering open. He took a sip of water from the metal cup Ethan had handed him and spoke, his voice hoarse. "Not someone," he rasped. "Something." His gaze shifted to the shepherd and her pup. "Her." Ethan's stomach tightened. He glanced at the mother, who had bristled at Sam's words, her body coiled and ready to spring. Ethan straightened, his hands clenching into fists. "You're going to explain that," he said, his voice cold. Sam nodded weakly. "She's not just any dog," he began. "She came from a lab, a testing facility. They were running experiments to see how far an animal could endure, how much it could survive. They wanted to build the perfect survivor. But she wasn't supposed to escape. And she definitely wasn't supposed to make it this far." Ethan's jaw tightened as the words sank in. He glanced at the shepherd, who had shifted closer to her pup, her golden eyes locked on Sam. "You're saying they were experimenting on her?" Ethan asked, his voice low and filled with anger. Sam nodded again. "Not just her," he said. "Her pup. She wasn't meant to have him, but she did, and that's why they want her back so badly. She's the only success they've had. She defied every odd, escaped every trap. And now, she's a threat to everything they've built. If they catch her, they won't stop at taking her back. They'll tear her apart to find out why she's different." The shepherd growled low in her throat, her eyes narrowing as if she understood every word. Ethan stepped between her and Sam, his body blocking her view of the stranger. "And what about you?" he asked sharply. "Are you here to take her back?" Sam shook his head. "Oh, I left the lab when I saw what they were doing. I've been trying to shut it down ever since. But I knew she'd be hunted, and I knew I had to find her first. To help her." Ethan wasn't convinced. The room felt too small, the air too thick. He looked at Sam, then back at the mother and her pup. The pup stirred weakly under the blanket, letting out a faint whimper. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, drawing Ethan's focus back to what mattered. "If you're lying," Ethan began, but Sam cut him off. "I'm not," he said, his voice steady despite his weakened state. "But you don't have time to decide if you trust me. The lab knows where she is. They'll come for her, and when they do, you won't be able to stop them on your own." The words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Ethan looked back at the shepherd. She was watching him, her golden eyes filled with a silent plea. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What do we do?" he asked. Sam pushed himself upright, his face pale but determined. "There's a contact in town," he said. "Someone who can help us get her out of here, off their radar for good. But we have to move now." Ethan nodded reluctantly. "Fine," he said. "But if this is a trap?" Sam met his gaze. "It's not." The journey to town was slow and grueling. The storm had passed, but the snow was deep and the wind still carried a biting chill. Ethan carried the pup, who was wrapped tightly in a blanket, while the mother stayed close by his side. Sam followed behind, his movements sluggish but purposeful. Every step felt like a gamble, the weight of their mission pressing down on them like the frozen air. They reached the edge of the forest just as the sun began to rise. The town lay ahead, its rooftops glinting with frost. But before they could move forward, the faint hum of engines broke the stillness. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The mother growled softly, her ears flattening against her head. "Drones," Sam whispered. "They're here." Ethan's grip tightened on the pup as his eyes scanned the horizon. The hum grew louder, and soon, the faint red glow of searchlights cut through the trees. "We need to move," Ethan said sharply, his voice low. "Now." The group moved quickly, darting between the shadows of the trees. The shepherd led the way, her instincts sharp and unerring. Ethan followed close behind, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The drones swept overhead, their lights slicing through the darkness like knives. Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts as he crouched low, holding the pup close to his chest. He glanced at the mother, who had frozen beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the machines above. When the lights moved on, Ethan exhaled shakily. "You're incredible," he whispered to her. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened briefly before she nudged him forward. Together, they pushed on, disappearing deeper into the forest as the hum of the drones faded into the distance. The sanctuary loomed ahead, a sprawling expanse of protected land hidden deep in the mountains. The group reached the edge of the forest, their breaths visible in the icy air. Ethan stopped, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The shepherd stood beside him, her body tense but alert. The pup stirred weakly in his arms, letting out a faint whimper. "We're almost there," Ethan said softly, his voice cracking with relief. He looked at Sam, who nodded and motioned for them to keep moving. The final stretch was uphill, the snow crunching under their feet as they climbed. Ethan's muscles burned, but he didn't stop. Not when they were so close. When they finally reached the sanctuary gates, the sight took Ethan's breath away. The land stretched endlessly, blanketed in snow and surrounded by towering pines. A river cut through the valley, its icy surface sparkling in the morning light. It was beautiful, untouched, a place where the shepherd and her pup could finally be safe. A figure emerged from the gatehouse, an older man with a kind face and a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Sam," he called out, his voice echoing through the crisp air. "You made it." "Barely," Sam replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But we need to get them inside." "Now." The man nodded and opened the gates, motioning for them to enter. Ethan stepped through, the weight of the journey finally lifting from his shoulders. The shepherd stayed close to him, her golden eyes scanning the sanctuary as if ensuring it was truly safe. When they reached the central clearing, Ethan set the pup down carefully on a soft blanket. The mother immediately curled around her pup, nuzzling it gently. For the first time, Ethan saw her body relax completely. "You did it," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside her. He rested a hand on her head, his eyes meeting hers. "You kept him safe. And now you're free." The shepherd licked his hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the pup wiggle closer to its mother, letting out tiny yips of contentment. The sight was simple, but it carried a weight he couldn't put into words. Sam approached, his expression solemn. "This place will protect them," he said. "No one will find them here." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. "Good," he said. "That's all that matters." As the sun rose higher, bathing the sanctuary in golden light, Ethan stood and took a step back. The shepherd watched him, her golden eyes filled with a silent promise. She would take it from here. She would give her pup the life it deserved. Ethan turned to Sam, who clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," Sam said. "I know," Ethan replied. And for the first time in a long while he felt at peace. The journey had been perilous, the stakes unimaginable, but in the end it was worth it. The bond between man and dog, forged in the harshest of storms, had triumphed over those who sought to break it. Together, they had found freedom, hope, and a new beginning. And as Ethan walked away, the warmth of the sanctuary at his back, he knew they had all survived the storm, not just the one outside, but the one inside their hearts.